Hello, everybody. My name's Nathan Kern. I'm a dev here at Oasis Digital. Chris, my colleague here, is going to give a talk on eliminating anti-patterns in large corporations. She has a lot of experience in this. We're also going to do a STL Dev Fest is next Saturday, and we'll be presenting a whole track there. Chris will be presenting this there, and I'll be talking about native script, and we have a talk on Cypress and some other stuff. So it's $30. Come on out and see us there. We have a discount code of Oasis discount. Just put that in the coupon code and save $5. Chris will take it away.
Okay. Hi, I'm Chris Hardin. I'm a senior developer at Oasis, and I'm usually brought into client projects in kind of an architecture or tech lead kind of role. And so recently, I keep getting brought in late and having to kind of fix stuff. And right now, currently, I've been working on something for several months of kind of re-architecting what's pretty much the largest app I've ever seen, honestly, and trying to pull it apart and get something that's stable and performant. And so here's kind of talking about, so, in these large corporations, you start off with an app, and then the business just keeps demanding more and more features. And the business, they usually drive the budget, and they really only care about things that they perceive as having a direct business value and impact. So as you're working to slam out these new features, and you're throwing in more money to bring in more developers, and you're running out of experienced developers, you end up with this kind of beast that's growing out of control and a pile of tech debt that just keeps increasing with no end in sight. Eventually, you get to the point, this critical point, where the app takes 30 seconds to load the first page, and you have 5 teams working on things, and every little thing causes something else to break. And finally, you're at that point where the tech debt can't be ignored anymore. And that's usually where I come in. So trying to tackle this kind of this mess. And so what I'm presenting today is really like kind of a list of the steps I actually have been working through myself, and kind of how I did that, and some of the tools to do that. Okay, so here I have kind of the steps I've been going through. The first step, might seem like a no-brainer. Making sure Angular is up to date, first of all. In large corporations, you tend to move slowly. Once you start a project on an Angular version, the idea that you want to constantly be upgrading versions is kind of a new and uncomfortable thing for people. But with Angular, it's so stable, after 2, right? So the idea is these new versions, going from 4 to 8, isn't actually that big of a deal in terms of work, but it makes a huge difference in terms of performance and the availability of tooling. So letting yourself continue to be stuck on an old version is just a really bad idea. So the first thing, make sure everything's up to date. Take that little bit of effort. Don't worry about risk. I mean, it's really not that risky, and you're going to get a performance improvement just from doing that if you're on a really old version. And you can stop following old patterns that you got into because of older versions of things. The second point here is AOT, which seems like a no-brainer, but isn't to everybody. So, sometimes, ahead of time compilation. So, when you run ngserve or you just run ngbuild, you're going to get the just-in-time compilation. And the thing about just-in-time compilation is, it's doing more work in the browser, so performance impact. And also, it's not catching all the little errors and bugs that are in your templates. And so what I've seen is sometimes if people start to run into AOT errors, once they turn it on, they just turn it off. Problem solved. It compiles. And the longer you leave that AOT flag turned off, the harder it's going to be to turn it back on again. And it really makes a huge difference, not only in runtime performance, but also in catching bugs, catching references to variables that aren't there. Okay, so all that static analysis that Angular does during ahead time compilation is really valuable. And don't just turn it on when you actually go to production, turn it on in your CI/CD pipeline for all of your environments. The only time you should be running without AOT is when you do ngserve on your local machine, okay? And all developers should be trained to run an AOT build locally before they submit a pull request. Let Angular do a lot of the work for you, okay? The next thing here is untangling the spaghetti. So in the situation I described, you look at the app and you're guaranteed to have a big tangled mess of interdependencies. The best practice way of structuring an Angular application these days is, to create kind of feature modules, so you should look at an app and you should see folders that represent main features in your application. But even so, even if you started down that path, on these large applications, when you start to look at them, you'll find that the folders are kind of lying. Things are kind of intertangled all over the place. New developers come in, they slam in new features, and just these connections just keep getting made all over. And so untangling that mess is really kind of the biggest step. And so I'm going to go into that in more detail on the next slide. And that's where I'm going to focus most of my time. Next one here, governance of libraries. So the more third-party libraries you have, the slower your app is going to load, right? You're loading more code. And so in a large application with large teams, if developers are just going in and think, oh, I need a widget that does X. Let me Google. Okay, throw that in there. Joe Bob's library from NPM, great. Last updated 2 years ago. Stuff like that is going to really start to have an impact. If you're pulling in multiple UI libraries from different places. And so you need to make sure that somebody is taking charge of that and you have some sort of governance of a strategy for pulling in third-party libraries, choosing the best ones, making sure that they're tree shakeable, that they load well, that they're not bloating your initial bundle ridiculously. And also that goes back to number one. Another reason why people get stuck on an old version of Angular is because they've pulled in so many third-party libraries from whoever on NPM, and they're last updated 3 years ago. Now they're stuck on an old Angular version. So my advice there is either, migrate away from that old library, or, it's usually always open source. Copy it off GitHub, throw it in your own repo, update it yourself, right? It's not that hard usually to migrate these things to the latest version of Angular. So just go ahead and take ownership of it at that point if it's too hard to eliminate it from your code base. Lint and Prettier, turn those on in your CI/CD pipeline. Next one, switch map. Learn to use switch map. Make sure everyone's using switch map. So if you're not using RxJS pipelines for anything, anytime you're doing a query based on user input, if you're not using an RxJS pipeline, you're not using switch map, things are going wrong, whether you can detect it or not, right? You're going to have timing issues. If you have all these little custom type ahead fields where the user's entering in stuff, maybe the first request takes 5 seconds and the second request takes 4. Things are going to arrive out of order, okay? Eventually they will arrive out of order. You may not notice it, but when you go to production, a user is going to encounter that. If you have lots of different things making the same request, like they click a filter button or they type in here or this or that, all those need to be pulled together into a proper RxJS pipeline with a switch map so that you're canceling the old requests and only getting the most recent ones and freeing up your server. Okay. The last few, and again, the main focus of this talk is going to be on the spaghetti line on line 2, so we'll get into that some more. The last few things here, I say more granular loading indicators. So what people like to do on the front page of an app is put a big dashboard with lots of little widgets, with lots of counts and numbers of things. And all these little counts and numbers of things are usually doing kind of expensive queries to the back end, to various databases and microservices and things like that. And before you know it, the user can't load the front page, can't do anything in the app because there's a giant loading indicator while like 10 requests are going back to various microservices. And so kind of going through and trying to say what is actually optional for the user to use the app. Do they need to see all 10 counts at the bottom, or can they start using the menu right away? And so making sure you're not blocking the user on these requests that aren't really necessary, they're just informative to the user. So kind of trying to break that down a bit. And then the next one is change detection. So, out of the box, Angular uses the, least efficient change detection strategy. And so when you get into these large apps, you start to see the impact of that. Especially, you're writing a component in this large app, but you don't know what's going on in the rest of the application. You don't know how many intervals or timers or WebSockets or various things are causing stuff to happen all the time in your application, even when the user's not actually doing anything. So by making your components have on-push change detection, you're insulating yourself a bit from that. If somebody set an interval to update a little widget every 5 seconds, I don't want my component to keep redrawing for no reason. Okay, and so if you start to put on-push change detection on components as much as you can, it starts to kind of reduce the impact of other bad practices, basically. And so your application's not constantly redrawing, constantly eating up CPU cycles when it's not really even doing anything. And then tests. Usually these applications, features have been churned out, tests have been kind of ignored. And I put it last because we're going to be doing a whole bunch of refactoring. And so, and people I'm sure will passionately argue this with me, but I leave the tests for last at this point because we already have a giant application with no tests. Let's just wait till we refactor it and then put them in. Otherwise, we're going to be doing a lot of rework and rework and rework because in a minute, we're going to be moving stuff around a lot, okay? But tests are good. Okay, so the big problem here is all the interdependencies and this giant mass of code that's all in one big app, okay? So first point here is modules. You need modules, lots and lots of modules. And so, back in the beginning, when we first started talking about Angular modules, there was always the question of, what granularity should I have here? Should I have one module for my whole app? How should I decide at what level to put in modules? And I used to think it didn't matter that much until I started dealing with these enormous applications. And with these normal applications, inevitably, you run into the issue where you're trying to just get the thing to load in a reasonable amount of time. And then you're trying to turn to lazy loading, okay? And you can't effectively do lazy loading and improve your performance unless you have everything properly split out into lots of modules. So if you have this big mess, the first thing to do is go in and just start adding lots and lots of modules at a very granular level. And that's going to be your first step in pulling things apart, moving them around, and getting optimal lazy loading. And that leads into my second point here, the kitchen sink modules. Okay, and the first bullet under there, core module and shared module. These were what I would call the really big anti-patterns that are causing lots of problems. Okay, and core module, is really a holdover from pre-Angular 6, right? So before Angular 6, when we introduced lazy loading, we got the problem of now our singleton services aren't singletons anymore, right? Somebody throws in a lazy loaded module, suddenly we have 2 instances of something, and everything breaks. So the answer to that was this core module pattern, okay? Well, we'll just take all of our application services and throw them into core module. There's just an understood rule that core module is only imported into app module, so we never have the problem of services getting provided in lazy loaded modules, so everything's always a singleton and we can keep moving on as before. The problem with that is you end up with a folder, generally called a core module, that has all kinds of services that have nothing to do with each other, right? They're all cross-feature services. So you just have this big bucket of stuff, of business logic that has nothing to do with each other. And that gets loaded into your main app bundle, okay? Anything those depend on gets loaded into your main app bundle. So now you can't do proper lazy loading because all of your business logic is in one giant bucket. Angular 6 introduced the idea of the provided in root syntax. So now we don't have to associate services with modules anymore. And that frees us up to take those services and move them where they belong, which is in a feature module, or in a feature folder, right? They don't really belong to a module anymore. But we can kind of collate that code with the feature components and modules and things that it actually pertains to. And by doing the provided in root, then it only actually gets loaded when it's actually used, okay? So if our main components don't use them, they don't get loaded into our first page load, okay? The second one is shared module. So again, you know, components can only be declared in a single Angular module. So great, we start having feature modules, and then we start creating reusable components. And so we need to put our reusable components somewhere so that they can be used in multiple features. So the first answer to that is, okay, create something called shared module. All reusable widgets go in shared module. Once your application reaches any sort of size, that is now an anti-pattern. Okay, so now you have this giant bucket of stuff, none of it really associated with each other, that gets loaded in every single module, every single route. Okay, and so that is a huge problem. So now we need to start breaking that stuff down. Again, my recommendation, you know, if you're walking into this situation, is to just start throwing a module with every component. Open up shared module folder, open up every component folder, throw in a module. Go super granular to start off with. And that's kind of the step that takes the most time, honestly. Going through there, because now you're going to have to go through the rest of your application, look at each template, and kind of decide, you know, which of these shared things are being used in every feature module, and really break stuff up. Once you've done that and you have everything working again, then if you see that, you know, well, these three widgets are always used together, then you can kind of, you know, roll things up again a bit, you know, create a module for those three components and do that. But I recommend just starting off by just throwing a module everywhere and kind of seeing, so you can really see what is depending on what and work it out that way. And in that same kind of vein, we have other things like, you know, if you have a module called pipes or directives or, you know, common something, usually that's a sign that that's something that needs to be broken up into kind of what is this module actually, what are these components actually related to? What kind of feature, what kind of operation are they for? And group things by what they do, not what they are. The next line is a problem I ran into. This idea of separating routable modules from importable modules. So if you have a feature module and you're trying to lazy load it, but that feature module also has some components that are used by another feature module, now you're going to have a problem. Okay, and I did run into this. And so you think you're lazy loading, but you're not really, because your module's being loaded multiple times. It's being loaded by the router for the lazy loading, but it also had a few components that somebody decided they wanted to use over here in another module. So then they imported it over here. The next thing you know, yeah, stuff's crazy, and you're not sure why anything works, and you change something slightly and it stops, right? So your routing sort of works, maybe, unless you know. So making sure that routable modules, which are things that we are directly lazy loading, are separated from modules that contain components we're going to use anywhere else. And actually, I have in my code example, I have something that I added to kind of enforce that a bit, to make sure nobody makes that mistake again. And then, of course, lazy loading. Lazy load all the things, okay? Just lazy loading all your modules. First of all, it helps make sure that you, you know, the process of turning on lazy loading for everything helps you, you know, go through and break up your modules in the first place. And again, it's going to make sure you have good performance as you're loading different features. Okay, I'll get to the index in a second. Types. It's not that hard to add types, okay? People just, they get lazy, they're like any, move on. That's great today, it sucks tomorrow, okay? And to do any of this refactoring, you're gonna need types, particularly from the back end. So, you know, at the absolute laziest, all you have to do is open the network tab, hit the page that makes the query, copy, paste into, there's a website called JSON2TS, gives you an interface, throw it in the app. It takes like 2 minutes. Just do it, okay? So anywhere as you're going along, anywhere you see that any coming from the back end, just run it, start putting those types in. You're gonna need it. Because to do any of this kind of refactoring, you have to know what types are being passed around. And obviously, there's going to be like 100 bugs you're going to catch because you suddenly realize that 5 different components are using the same type from the back end, and they don't agree on what the properties actually are. And the last one here is component CSS. So, you know, Angular gave us this idea of kind of having kind of a virtual encapsulation of our components with regard to the styling, right? So we can define CSS for a component. It doesn't bleed out. It doesn't bleed down. Sounds like a great idea. Okay. Problem is, you get into this large enterprise environment, people are slamming in features, they're not talking to each other, you got all these developers. Next thing you know, every CSS file is this big, it's repeated everywhere, and you're kind of losing the point of CSS, you know, this idea of a kind of a styles that cascade down, you know. You're repeating everything everywhere. The CSS itself is bloating your app and bloating your bundles. So it's time to start kind of dialing that back. Global styles are a good thing. They give you that styles.css file for a reason. So kind of let's not get carried away with this tool that Angular has given us. You know, the CSS, the Sass folks, they've been thinking about architecture too. There are strategies out there for organizing Sass files and things like that, for architecting that in a more global fashion so that developers aren't just copying and pasting and slamming in enormous chunks of CSS over and over again. Okay, so and that's the problem that we're starting to tackle right now. We haven't actually gotten into it yet, but trying to just pull all of that out and do CSS the way it's supposed to be done. Okay, so back to the index point. Okay, so again, my current project that I'm working on, you know, I started off with the first few points here, and I got all that working, and then I moved to NX. And so NX is going to help me take all of those modules and turn them into independent libraries. And the benefit that's going to give me is it's going to help me not only break up the dependencies now, but help ensure that they don't just come back again. That tomorrow, when there's 40 developers slamming in code, they're not just going to create a new mess. Okay. So, and this is kind of the steps for doing it. So we have this giant application. We want to create an NX workspace. And okay, first of all, what is NX? So NX, from our perspective right here, NX is really kind of an extension to the Angular CLI tooling. Now it has grown to be much more than that. You can do React and Nest and all kinds of things with it. But what we care about right now with this topic is its Angular support, right? So it adds an extensions to the Angular CLI to make it easier to, within one workspace, have applications and libraries and break up your code, okay? And not only does it help you break up your code into libraries, but it helps you enforce their interdependencies. It also helps you visualize them by actually generating graphs for you, which is really cool. And so to kind of get from where we are to having this nice broken up NX workspace, the way I approached it was to just generate a brand new NX workspace with an empty Angular app, and then take my existing application, all the source code, and basically I moved it into a library called Monolith, okay, with the idea that that was a temporary thing that I was just going to slowly start pulling pieces out of. And so this is a work in progress. You're pulling it out into lots of little libraries. But it's runnable the whole time. So you can iterate over this over a period of time. And so I've actually, there's my reference slide. I started doing this with, of course, the Tour of Heroes. Because unfortunately, I can't show you my actual code. So I have a Tour of Heroes app here in an NX workspace. I'm not going to create it from scratch because that would just take too much time. But just real quick, and we're also going to be kind of seeing kind of the architecture, the organization that NX recommends. So NX is really just a tool that makes building libraries and apps easier, But they also, NX, Narwhal, they also kind of give you a guideline of how to actually organize your stuff. So, and that's what I've been trying to follow. So here under apps, we're going to have the tour of heroes, okay? And so apps, it is plural. We're going to have one workspace that has any number of applications in it. Now, if you're Google or Narwhal or some of those, you know, this would be a mono repo for your entire organization. You don't have to go that far. In this case, I'm thinking of mono repo in terms of maybe a project or kind of a domain, okay? So your mono repo can kind of be at different levels. But at least for this particular project, we're going to have a mono repo that has all of our libraries and related applications together in one space. And that's going to make it easy for us to build and deploy everything, and for developers to work on stuff. So in here, I can have any number of apps under this apps folder. And here I have Tour of Heroes, TOH, and I have dash desktop. So the idea is that the things under this apps folder are going to be very thin shells around libraries. And so I could have Tour of Heroes dash desktop, Tour of Heroes dash mobile, okay? And so they're not going to have much in them other than an app component. And then we're going to call out to components loaded from other libraries. So to make our real code, our real features and things as reusable as possible. So we're just kind of packaging them for different use cases. So in this case, I just have the desktop version here. And if I open it up, so this is going to look like any other Angular CLI app. Okay, and if I look in here, and this is where my assets and all that stuff goes. But under app, I only have an app component, which you can see just has a router outlet, nothing more. And my app module, which has one route in it. Okay. And so my one route is going to load what we call my feature shell. Okay. So there's kind of two levels of wrapper here. But again, it's the idea that with the apps, you might have slightly different apps for different situations, like mobile versus desktop. Okay. So all it's going to do is load my main module, which is in a library. And so every library in this NX workspace is going to be scoped, in this case with starjumper30. So starjumper30 is just my GitHub handle, so I decided to use that here. And that's all controlled in an NX configuration file. So if we look down here, this whole workspace, it should look just like an Angular CLI workspace with the addition of this index.json. Now, there's not a lot in this index.json file. It does have your scope. So here's this npm scope. That's why everything is prefixed with @starjumper30 by default. Okay, so this would be like your company name or your domain name or something like that. And then you can see it lists all the projects in here with some tags, which I'll talk about in a minute. So again, my app component is just a really thin shell with a single route, okay, where I'm lazy loading my feature shell. So this is Tour of Heroes desktop app. I've got a library called Tour of Heroes feature shell. So we'll see what that looks like. And again, so all I did for the Tour of Heroes, again, if you're not familiar, the Tour of Heroes is the tutorial provided by the Angular.io website. And so all I did was pull down the zip file, throw it into my NX workspace, and start breaking it up. Okay, so what I'm showing here is where I've done a little bit of the work, and then we'll do a little bit more. Okay, so we've got our app. So now if we look under the libs, we'll start to see how we structure our libraries. So under libs, we're going to start grouping things by what we call scope. So here I have a folder called TOH for Tour of Heroes. This is going to be libraries that are very specific to my Tour of Heroes application. And in a minute, as we break stuff out, we're going to see how under here we have a shared folder for components and things that are reusable across many contexts. I'm also going to have a heroes folder for things that are related to heroes as a kind of a domain area, but not necessarily specifically the Tour of Heroes app. So we can start to break things out that way. So right now, just kind of at the starting point, I've got my app shell, or my app up there, which is just the app component. I have this thing called my feature shell library, This is a CLI library, okay? And then I also have my feature monolith. And so if I look under feature monolith, oops, okay. So here in this source lib under here, under feature monolith library, this is where I've taken pretty much everything out of that Tour of Heroes zip file I downloaded, and I just dumped it in here. So, you know, if you're going in to refactor a large application, this is literally what I did on my real project. I just took the entire contents of app and dumped it into this library called Monolith, and then started moving pieces out one at a time. So I just dumped that in here. And then the other kind of NX architecture specific thing here is the feature shell itself. So the feature shell is really just going to have this kind of main component. So we look at the main component for Tour of Heroes. So this content I actually pulled out of the Tour of Heroes app component. Okay. So now my app component is really just a router outlet that loads my feature shell. And in my feature shell here, I have just kind of the framing. So here you can see, you know, I have the kind of the common header for my, there you go, the common header for my Tour of Heroes app. I've got some footer stuff maybe, and then I have my main router outlet. So all of my main lazy routes, my real application routes, are going to be defined in this feature shell library. So if I look at my feature shell module, you can see here I have all of my routes. And I do have a to-do statement here. I want to eventually make these all lazy loaded routes, okay? Right now, they're actually importing all of the other components from my feature monolith library, okay? And the nice thing about when you're using the NX tooling, you don't have to worry about building libraries in order or before you run your app, anything like that. It does it all on the fly for you. So I can just ngserve this thing, and it builds the appropriate libraries and pulls everything in together for me. And so it's really painless. If you just use the Angular CLI to do a similar thing, it's a lot more painful. You have to kind of go in and build things in order yourself and then run the app. Okay. So here we have that. And so again, my goal then is going to be to, first of all, move all of these into separate feature libraries. So the dashboard would be a feature library, the hero detail would be a separate feature library, and so on. And each of these feature libraries would then be lazy loaded routes. But this is kind of where I'm starting from. I'm pulling the big mess into my monolith library, creating that thin main shell, and then the app to run it. And at this point, I can ngserve it. So again, just because I'm in an NX workspace, I don't have to change too much the way I work. I can still use all the ng commands, like ngserve, ngbuild, nggenerate, and so on. That should be pretty quick. There we go. So here I have my Tour of Heroes. Okay. It should look the same as it's always looked. Okay. My little app. And so again, I have, you know, 3 main routes here, and I can think of those as kind of my 3 main features. I have the heroes route, which takes me to the list of heroes. I have the dashboard feature, and then I have, my mouse works, I have the ability to edit a particular hero. So those would be kind of the 3 main feature modules, which are going to become feature libraries of my NX application. And so, okay, so I've got it running, I've got the structure set up, it is an NX project now. So now I need to start doing the work of actually breaking down that monolith library. Again, our goal is to get rid of the monolith library entirely. And so there's, you know, a couple different ways to approach this. In this particular app, you know, I'm going to look at my routing table here and I'm going to say, you know what, dashboard, let's go ahead and get that into a feature library, okay? And so what I would do is actually, let me kill this. So I would just use my nggenerate command and say, you know what, I need a library, I need a library called feature-dashboard, okay? And I'm also going to specify a few flags here. I'm going to specify the directory, because I'm going to build up this folder structure that kind of shows the breakdown of my libraries into different scopes. So for this one, the directory is still TOH. So that's the directory under libs. And I can specify some tags. Sorry. And these tags are what we're going to use to enforce how the dependencies can be drawn between libraries. And so the ones suggested by Narwhal are a scope. So in this case, it's Tour of Heroes. So this is specific to the Tour of Heroes app. I don't intend to use it anywhere else. And also what type of library it is. So NX has, they suggest a few basic types. So feature is what this one's going to be. And we'll see some of the other kind in a minute. So type, feature, scope, Tour of Heroes. So those two flags I passed in are the only part that's kind of specific to using the NX stuff. So basically what NX has done is it provides some schematics that extend the built-in Angular CLI schematics for generating libraries and applications and things like that. So let's see. There we go. So you see here, it created a library called feature dashboard. And so by default, it creates a module file and this module spec file, which I personally delete. If somebody can explain to me why you would test a module, I'd love to hear it, but I've not seen any reason. So they create this empty module, which just has, common module. And you can see the naming convention for the module kind of follows the folder structure here. So the scope is Tour of Heroes, it's a feature module, and it's dashboard. So we're kind of using that naming convention. And so now I've got this module, and I'm going to go into my Monolith library. My mouse works. Okay. Go into my Monolith library and find my dashboard component. Stop. Okay. There we go. And I'm just going to select all these guys, and I'm going to move them up to my new library. Okay. Maybe this would work better. Okay. So now I'm just going to declare this guy. Dashboard. Export him. Okay. Great. Now let's look at this component and see what it depends on. Okay. Now, we don't want anything in this feature dashboard library. We don't want it to reference back into the monolith. So we've now started this chain of events, right? So I want to pull out the dashboard component. Great. But I'm not done yet, because now I'm like, oh, it needs this hero type and it needs this hero service. So now I go down this kind of train of refactoring. And so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna move the hero service out. And so if I look at this hero service, I'm going to look at it and decide what kind of library it should go in. Okay, so hero service, let's see, where is it at? Okay, so in the Tour of Heroes application was just here, kind of at the root. I kind of look at it and see what it's doing. Okay, so this is really what we call a data access service, right? This is for calling the back end and manipulating our data. And so this would go in a data access library. And this is specific to what I'm going to call the heroes domain. And so I'm actually going to create a new scope called heroes. So I'm going to say nggenerate library. I want to create one called data access -hero or something like that. And I did it wrong. It used to prompt you, and now you have to actually pass in the flags, which I find inconvenient, because we want to specify the directory. And so it's going to go, let's create a directory called heroes. So again, we want to have a set of libraries that deal with kind of this heroes domain or part of our business, but aren't necessarily completely specific to our Tour of Heroes app. Maybe we're going to have a different app that deals with hero data, So then the tags, we're going to say scope is heroes. This is a little bit slightly more generic. and then the type is going to be data access. Okay. And so we would pull that service into that library and so on. Let's see if I can get that far. Okay, so up here now, let's see. I've got, dang it. Oh, that's the old one. Hold on. Okay, this was my first aborted attempt there. Okay, so I created the heroes folder and it created this data access hero library. Again, it always generates a module. I don't want the module file because I'm just going to put a service in here. And again, I don't put services in modules. So I'm just going to delete that. And then I'm going to take my, go to my monolith. I'm going to grab my hero service, and I'm going to move it to heroes, data access, lib. Okay. And the one thing I always forget to do is for every library, you're going to have this index.ts file, which is your publicly exposed API for this library. So here I'm going to fix this. I don't have a module file, but I do want to expose this hero service that I just put in there. Okay. And so I think it's fine. Oh, thanks. Okay. So I do want to expose this hero service. So now, okay, I've got this hero service. I'm going to back up to my dashboard component that I was working on. And so now I can replace this file path import for, actually I'm on the wrong one, this one. File path import, which looks hideous. And now I'm going to import it from data access hero. Okay. So another benefit of this is you get rid of all those really long ... slash. So now I'm going to have things grouped together. I look at my file. The next one I'm going to do is hero. Hero is really just a type that represents the shape of the data coming from the back end, coming from hero service. So I'm actually just going to move that into my hero service, or my data access hero library along with the service. And then those two lines will become one. Yeah, I'm not going to do all that right now. But if I look at my hero service again, though, for a moment, again, we kind of go down this little rabbit hole. What is it doing? Well, it depends on hero, which I've already said. I'm going to go ahead and move that into this library. That makes sense. It's just the typing for the back end. The other thing it does is uses this thing called message service. So let's look at what message service does. Once I can get it to open it. Message service. Okay, what is message service? Well, when I look at it, it really looks just like kind of a generic service to store an array of messages. So there's nothing in here but that says heroes, okay? So this to me feels like something that would go in the scope shared, because it has nothing to do with the domain or business of my application. It's just a reusable, very generic sort of thing. It's not a UI component though, so I'm just going to throw it into a library of type util, for lack of a better name. So the four types that Narwhal lists in their document is data access for things related to accessing data from the back end, feature, UI for reusable UI components that don't really use any back-end services, and then util for kind of other stuff. So here, this I would put into a library called shared, or in the shared folder, scope of shared, probably called util message service or something like that. And so here you can see how we just keep breaking things out this way. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to the answer. This takes a while to get all the pieces aligned. So if I remember what my branch was called. Okay, just a second. Okay, great. Okay, so when I'm done moving the dashboard component out, this is what we end up with. So I've got, I've got my heroes scope, my shared scope, again, for things that really have nothing to do with heroes at all, like logging. And then my tour of heroes, which has features that are extremely specific to my tour of heroes app and aren't going to be reused in another app. Okay. And then heroes, again, are things I think might be reused if I create an app for a different purpose that uses hero data for some reason. So here I have my hero search feature, and then my data access stuff. Why do I have two of them? Hold on. Delete that one. Okay. So I used a different name. Okay. So here we go. So I have my data access, and then I have dashboard split out, and I still have the rest of my stuff under Monolith. Let's look at my main routing file, which I hadn't updated yet. So now if we look at my feature shell main routing, so these are the main routes for my application, I am now lazy loading my feature dashboard module. So my end goal is for all of these routes to look like that, to be lazy loading a module from a different feature library. So far, I only had time to do the dashboard. Okay, and as I do that, I'm going to be breaking out all these different pieces until the monolith disappears. Okay, so the last thing, since I'm running out of time, I want to show is, okay, this is great. How does this help us prevent spaghetti as far as, how do we keep these libraries from depending on each other in weird ways? And so that's where the TS Lint rules come in. So when you generate an NX workspace, it adds a plugin here. So we have a narwhal plugin for TS Lint, and it gives you this lint rule here: NX enforce module boundaries. And this is where those tags come into play. So every time I created a library, I gave it some tags. I gave it a scope tag, and I gave it a type tag. And that's actually just kind of the convention that Narwhal gives you. You can make any tags you want, okay? And in the lint file, you're going to use these tags to create rules. And so here I can say that, well, libraries that have a shared scope, or in the scope shared, can only depend on other libraries with a scope of shared, because these are supposed to be reusable components across anything. They shouldn't have any dependencies on libraries under my heroes domain or my TOH features. Okay, and so you can see here, heroes can access heroes or shared. Tour of heroes can access, anything under tour of heroes or shared, right? If I had another application in here, I would have another scope, and then that one would not be able to access tour of heroes, right? So we can break these things out however we like. So the first set of rules, I'm doing it based on scope, and then I'm going to do some based on type. So data access, that's pretty low level. Those libraries are really just for accessing the back end and dealing with domain data. So I want the data access libraries to maybe access other data access libraries, or maybe access some util libraries. But they shouldn't be accessing UI components. That doesn't make any sense. And they shouldn't be accessing features. We have a hierarchy of things here. So features, access, UI, util, or data access. UI libraries should really only access other UI libraries, maybe some util, things like that. So we can start to enforce these rules that help us maintain our architecture. And so if I break this, so I'm going to remove one of these. So I'm going to say that tour of heroes can only access shared or tour of heroes. So now it cannot access the heroes, anything under the heroes scope. So now if I do npm run lint, there you go. So you can see that it immediately blew up here and told me that how I was violating those dependency rules. Okay. And so you can enforce that. The other thing it does is npm run dep graph. And this is pretty cool. And so now I can see exactly how my libraries are structured. So NX is providing me a graph of this, so I can see what my features are, what my libraries are, and how they depend on each other. And so again, the goal is to get this giant black hole monolith broken out until everything is clearly visualized. Okay. NX does a lot of other stuff too that we don't really have time to get into. It also includes prettier and commands for running that across all of the libraries and projects as well. Okay, so I think I'm out of time. Are there any questions? And let me put up the reference slide here. Again, all this code is available on my GitHub. So you should be able to see here. And I will probably, in the next week or so, be actually finishing that example out and get it completely broken down.
If you do have a question,
yeah.
I have a microphone, so just raise your hand and I'll give it to you.
Are there any like metrics that you would baseline before doing a significant refactor like this and check them after? Or any you can think of and recommend?
Well, that would be a good idea. Yeah, I'm not real good at collecting data. I'm more good at jumping right in and changing code. But I would suggest I mean, looking at things like your page load time is really the main thing I can think of. At least that was the biggest problem we were having. And so in looking at the size of the bundles that are coming in, I didn't have time to do it here, but I also have added in Webpack Bundle Analyzer and running that periodically to make sure I'm on track, kind of see what the problems are, and make sure that's going well. I don't know. Like I said, the apps I've seen, they're so obviously slow, and then it's just an obvious performance improvement once you fix the lazy loading, fix the AOT, and start doing this. And then the rest of it's really about making it easier to develop moving forward, making it easier for lots of teams of developers to get in here and work without stepping on each other and introducing weird dependencies and things like that.
So if you set up your lint to only allow dependencies with the correct scope, and you create a new library and you forget to add the scope that you need to it, you update it in the ngx.json for that library. Is that right?
Yeah, I forgot to show that. So yeah, right now if I have a application or library that doesn't have any scope on it, the way I have the rules set up, I don't have any wildcard rules in here. When you first create the workspace, it adds one rule that basically is just asterisk, asterisk, and it lets everything go through. So I deleted that wildcard rule and put in specific ones. So now if I add a library or an application and I forget to put a scope on it, it will error out on the lint. It'll say no. And so where are these defined? That's in the ngx.json. So there's not much in this ngx.json file, and this is really the only NX-specific configuration file in here. And every time you add a library or application, it adds an entry here under projects. And the only thing in here are the tags. And you can see all the tags that got added. And you can just go in here and add whatever you want, okay? So if you make up your own kind of convention of tags, you can just put them in here and add those to the lint rules. And so the other hard thing is, if you add a library and then later you decide to rename it or move it around a little bit, because that's going to happen, there's really 3 main files that need to get changed if you don't want to just delete it and have to re-add it. So your project's going to be referenced here in nx.json. Your tsconfig.json, again, these are at the root of the workspace. So in your tsconfig.json, under pass, each library is going to have an entry here to map that kind of library, the npm style library import to the actual path on the file system here. So you would need to change that file, and then also the angular.json. So just like any CLI project, all the projects are listed here under projects in the angular.json. So if you move stuff around or rename something, it's the nx.json, tsconfig.json, and angular.json at the root of the application. Yeah, the ngpackager stuff, actually by default, if you create an NX workspace, start generating libraries, it doesn't create any ngPackager configuration because it assumes you're always working in a mono repo for your whole organization and that you would never actually be publishing individual things. To actually have it add the ngPackager stuff for each library so that you could actually build it and publish it to like Artifactory or NPM or something, you can actually set a property on the schematics. I actually usually go ahead and do that here. So here's my angular.json. Again, this is all on GitHub. And these are kind of some of the customizations that I've added. So where is it at? Here we go. So here, there's a narwhal schematic that extends the Angular library schematic. And here, you can add this flag, publishable true. So if you have that flag there, every time you generate a library, it will add in all the ngPackager stuff as well, so that you can actually build it for publishing. And so if we go here, so any of these, because I have it turned on, so you get this ngpackage.json. So honestly, what I normally do if I'm renaming something is I'm in WebStorm, I go up to the root, I go edit, find, replace in path, and I just put in the old name and the new name, and it usually pretty much works. So, but yeah, really what you're going to change are those 3 files at the root, and then any configuration files within the library that you're changing, like ngPackager. And since I didn't mention it before, by default, out of the box, NX, when you create an NX workspace using the Angular preset, it automatically sets everything up for Cypress and Jest. If you're migrating an old application, it's unlikely that you're using Cypress and Jest. But you can actually then change that. So here you can see for all the schematics, I'm specifying Karma and Protractor in here. So now when I generate libraries, it puts in the correct configuration for Karma and Protractor. I think that was the only really important stuff here. So, any other questions? Okay, yes, I know, I'm way over time. So
We are out of time.
Thank you
Thank
all
you all
for
for
coming.
coming. Let's give Chris a round of applause. Again, don't forget about DevFest STL. It's next Saturday. Tickets are $30. We have the discount code Oasis discount, all lowercase, $5 off. Hope to see you there. Thank you.